Okay, so you're here with us because you really want to get to the bottom of things,
Yeah.
when it comes to power dynamics in our government, especially when different parts are clashing. So today we're going really deep on the recent tensions between the executive branch and the judicial branch under President Trump.
Yeah. Yeah. Especially with everything going on, it can get really confusing to keep track of everything.
It can.
I mean, we've got a ton of news articles, we've got analysis from experts, we've got it all right here.
Yeah, and we're going to try to make sense of it all,
Yeah.
right? We've got this whole dynamic relationship that we're going to be looking at and really trying to figure out what's at the core, you know?
Yeah. I mean, we're going to hit the big conflicts, the arguments about judicial overreach and
Yeah.
those underlying constitutional principles at stake.
Yeah.
The separation of powers and what that actually means in practice.
Exactly. And to give you a sense of what we're talking about, we're going to be looking at the deportation of those Venezuelan nationals.
Right.
We'll look at President Trump's attempts to remove certain members from federal boards, and of course, the whole executive order regarding birthright citizenship.
Yeah, that was a big one.
Okay, so let's jump right in with those Venezuelan deportations.
All right. So, the sources laid out pretty clearly that the Trump administration went ahead and started deporting over 250 Venezuelan nationals. And get this, they actually invoked the Alien Enemies Act
Wow.
of 1798, which, way back when, was meant to deal with citizens from enemy nations during times of war.
During a time of war.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that it seems like these individuals included people who were alleged members of the Tren de Aragua gang,
Okay.
a federally designated foreign terrorist organization.
So we're talking some serious national security stuff here.
Absolutely. But then Chief Judge James Boasberg stepped in
Right.
and ordered a halt to these deportations.
Yeah, and there's this one point that I thought was particularly fascinating. The Trump administration actually argued that once the planes carrying these individuals were already in the air,
Yeah.
the judge's verbal order was no longer binding.
Yeah.
Pretty bold stance, regarding the limits of judicial power.
It really is. And from what we can see in the articles, Judge Boasberg wasn't exactly buying it.
Mm.
He expressed some serious doubts about that argument.
I mean, it definitely raises questions.
It does.
How far can the judiciary actually go to keep the executive branch in check?
Right. And especially in areas like this, immigration, national security. I mean, the Alien Enemies Act from 1798, it's usually been interpreted to give the executive branch a lot of leeway in these situations.
It's true. We saw similar dynamics at play with President Trump's attempts to remove Kathy Harris from the Merit Systems Protection Board and Gwen Wilcox from the National Labor Relations Board.
Yeah. And it went beyond just disagreements.
Yeah.
Lower courts actually ruled that these firings were illegal.
So what does that tell us about presidential authority in these situations?
I think it brings up a huge question about the extent of the president's power to remove people from office.
Okay.
We know the president gets to appoint officials, but the ability to remove them, especially from these independent boards, that's where things get really complicated, legally speaking.
I see.
These cases, they really underline how important the judiciary is in setting those boundaries.
Yeah.
And the fact that lower courts push back suggests they have a different take on the president's authority in these specific cases.
And then, of course, we had that executive order trying to end birthright citizenship, which really stirred up a lot of debate. And once again, the courts got involved pretty quickly.
Oh, yeah. Federal judges didn't waste any time. They issued preliminary injunctions blocking that order from actually being implemented.
Yeah, and it's interesting because those injunctions specifically pointed to conflicts with the 14th Amendment.
Absolutely. And with well-established Supreme Court precedent, too.
So basically,
The judiciary is saying, look, we interpret the Constitution, and in our view, this executive action seems to be crossing some major constitutional lines.
it's fascinating to see these conflicts play out in such concrete ways.
It is.
But now let's flip the script a bit and really consider this idea that maybe it's the judiciary that's exceeding its authority.
Okay.
Because this whole notion that judges might be overstepping their constitutional limits is a really big part of this conversation.
Definitely. And a key argument that pops up a lot in the stuff you gathered is about these nationwide injunctions that district courts have been using more and more.
Yes.
Some people see them as absolutely essential for keeping executive power in check.
Makes sense.
But others see them as going way too far because you've got a single district judge who can basically stop a federal policy in its tracks across the entire country.
Yeah, I can see how that could be seen as disruptive to that whole balance of power thing.
Exactly. It's like this immense power being concentrated in one judge's hands. And the question is this really how the system was meant to work?
It's a good question.
And the argument goes even deeper, suggesting that sometimes these judicial actions actually prevent the executive branch from carrying out its constitutional duties,
Oh, wow.
especially in areas like immigration and national security, where the executive branch has traditionally had a lot of authority.
Okay.
So the concern is that these interventions from the courts might be unduly limiting the president's lawful powers as they're defined in the Constitution.
So it all boils down to this tension between what's written in the Constitution
Right.
and how it gets interpreted in practice.
Exactly.
Article 2 is crystal clear. It gives the president executive power, but then we have the judiciary whose whole job is to interpret that same Constitution.
Yeah, it's a delicate balance for sure. I mean, the
Yeah.
separation of powers, it wasn't meant to create these totally separate branches that never interact, you know?
Right.
It's more like the system of checks and balances
Right.
and the power of the judiciary to review what the executive branch is doing. That's a huge part of that system.
Absolutely. And we've seen some landmark Supreme Court cases that really illustrate this.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
United States v. Nixon back in 1974 is a classic example.
A big one.
The Supreme Court unanimously decided that President Nixon had to release those Watergate tapes.
Yeah.
And that sent a really powerful message. No one is above the law, not even the president. And the courts have the authority to force the executive branch to do certain things under the right circumstances.
Yeah, and that was a huge moment,
It was.
you know, for affirming the judiciary's role in all of this.
And more recently, we had Trump v. United States in 2024, which looked at the issue of presidential immunity.
Right, right. That one was all about clarifying the limits of executive power and how the courts can oversee it. The Supreme Court ruled that presidents do have immunity for actions that fall within their core constitutional duties, but not for private actions.
So those precedents give us a lot to think about as we try to make sense of these disagreements that keep popping up.
Yeah, they provide a lot of context
They do.
for understanding what's going on.
Okay, so let's really zero in on this idea that some judges might be going too far, exceeding their constitutional authority. What's the main argument here?
The argument at its heart is that certain judges, you know, they might be straying beyond their constitutional role.
Okay.
And as a result, encroaching on the powers that rightfully belong to the president, you know, the powers laid out in the Constitution and backed up by Supreme Court rulings.
And we see this view reflected in some of the analysis we've got here.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Like Glenn Reynolds, he gets right to the point and expresses this concern pretty directly.
Yeah, he even suggests that some of these judicial decisions might be driven by, well, how do I put this? He uses pretty strong language. He does. He basically says Trump hate,
Yeah, he does.
implying that personal dislike of President Trump might be skewing how some judges interpret the law.
That's a pretty serious charge.
It is to say that legal decisions are being influenced by personal feelings.
And the people who hold this view, they often point to cases like Ludek v. Watkins from way back in 1948, where the Supreme Court took a broad view of presidential authority under the Alien Enemies Act and put some pretty strict limits on how much the courts could review those kinds of removals.
So they're basically saying, look, in some of these newer cases, the courts seem to be moving away from precedents that traditionally gave the executive branch more leeway when it came to national security and immigration. And that raises some serious questions about whether they're properly respecting how executive power has been understood historically.
Exactly. They're worried that the courts might be tilting the balance of power too far in their direction.
So let's say this perceived trend of judicial overreach continues.
Okay.
What are some potential future scenarios?
Well, one thing we might see is more and more of these legal battles, you know, with the executive branch pushing back against rulings from the courts, which could lead to a ton of litigation and clog up the whole system.
Yeah, the courts could get so bogged down that it actually weakens their ability to effectively check executive power.
Yes, exactly.
And what about the Supreme Court? Could they step in and resolve these ongoing clashes?
They definitely have the authority to do that. You know, they can settle big disagreements between the executive branch and the lower courts.
Yep.
But here's the catch. The court ultimately relies on the executive branch to enforce its decisions.
Right.
So if you had a situation where the executive branch just routinely ignored what the Supreme Court said,
That would be bad.
that would seriously undermine the court's authority and effectiveness. It would be like challenging the very foundation of our system of checks and balances.
And that's when Congress would need to step up big time.
Right. Absolutely. They'd have to consider all sorts of options, you know, passing new laws to clarify everyone's powers, maybe even going as far as impeachment if they thought the president was acting outside the boundaries of the Constitution.
So we've gone through a lot here.
We have.
We've seen several examples of these tensions between the executive and judicial branches under President Trump.
Yeah, and it's clear there are different ways of looking at this whole situation. Is the
Oh.
judiciary acting as this essential check on power, or are they potentially crossing the line and infringing on the president's rightful authority?
It all comes back to these fundamental questions about how our government is structured and how power is supposed to be balanced between these co-equal branches.
And maintaining that balance, it requires us to really understand the separation of powers and commit to the rule of law,
Hmm.
and also to respect how each branch's authority has been understood historically.
Yeah, it's been a fascinating deep dive into a really crucial part of our government. And it makes you think about the long-term consequences of these conflicts. What's at stake for the structure of American governance and that essential principle of checks and balances.
Yeah, I think that's something we all need to be thinking about.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts on all of this? We want to hear your perspective. Head down to the comments and share your opinions. And if you're hungry for more deep dives into these complex and timely issues, hit that subscribe button. Thanks for joining us.